December 14, 1941. The village of Litza on the Kola Peninsula, 22 kilometers south of the Arctic Ocean. Temperature -37 degrees Celsius. The German 2nd Mountain Division has held a position on the eastern bank of the Litza River for 172 days. The men of Gebirgsjäger Regiment 136 are dug into fighting positions cut from ground that required explosives to break because the permafrost in this part of Norway does not yield to an entrenching tool. The positions are roofed with timber and packed snow, and in them men sleep in 4-hour rotations because 4 hours is the maximum duration before the cold penetrates a sleeping bag and a man begins to lose core body temperature in his sleep. There is no frontline movement today. There has been no frontline movement for weeks. The mission assigned to this regiment, the seizure of the port of Murmansk, 60 kilometers to the northeast, has been informally suspended since October. No order has been issued cancelling it. No order admitting failure has been written. But no attack has been launched, because every officer who has stood on this ground long enough to understand it has arrived at the same conclusion. The terrain does not permit forward movement, the supply line cannot support it, and the cold kills men faster than the enemy does. This is the Norwegian front in winter. This is what the German army walked into when it invaded Norway in April 1940, and what it discovered by increments over the following months and years constitutes one of the most thorough and costly educations in the limits of military power that the Second World War produced anywhere in the world. The story that follows is not the story of defeat in a single battle. It is not the story of a catastrophic encirclement or a decisive engagement. It is the story of something slower and in some ways more terrible than a lost battle. The story of an army that occupied a country and then discovered that the country itself was the most dangerous enemy it would ever face. It is the story of what cold actually does to a human body, and what darkness does to a human mind, and what distance does to a supply chain, and what all three together, compounded across 4.5 years, did to the men of the German Wehrmacht in Norway. It is the story of a war that most history books summarize in a paragraph, because the dramatic arc of it, no Stalingrad, no Kursk, no dramatic reversal, does not lend itself to the conventions of military narrative. The men who fought it left diaries. They wrote letters home that censors sometimes allowed through. Decades later, some of them sat down with historians and described what they remembered. What they described, consistently across dozens of accounts, was a specific quality of suffering that they reached for the same word to name: hell. They called it hell on earth. They were not exaggerating. To understand what the German army found in Norway, it is necessary first to understand what it expected to find. The invasion of Norway, Operation Weserübung, launched on the 9th of April 1940, was designed as a rapid, decisive seizure of a strategically vital country. The planning assumptions built into it were, in retrospect, breathtaking in their confidence. Norway would be taken in days. The Norwegian armed forces, small, under-equipped, and spread across an enormous country, would either capitulate quickly or be swept aside. The population would be managed. The country's iron ore exports, flowing south through the port of Narvik, would be secured for German industry. And the Wehrmacht's presence there would be primarily a garrison function. Important, yes, but not operationally demanding in the way that the Eastern Front or the Atlantic Campaign was operationally demanding. Norway would be held. It would provide bases. It would serve as the strategic shield on the northern flank. And then the war would be decided elsewhere, and Norway would remain quietly in German hands until the peace. None of this was unreasonable as planning assumptions go. The Norwegian army did collapse faster than anyone expected. The country was occupied, the iron ore route was secured. The strategic rationale for holding Norway, which Hitler came to regard as a near obsession, remained valid throughout the war. What the planners did not account for What no one in the OKW's map rooms in Berlin accounted for with any precision was the Norwegian winter. The word winter is inadequate for what occurs in Norway above the Arctic Circle between November and March. It is inadequate in the way that the word wet is inadequate to describe the North Atlantic in a force 12 storm. What happens in northern Norway in winter is a compound phenomenon: extreme cold, polar darkness, terrain that becomes categorically impassable for mechanized forces, wind that turns any exposed surface into a lethal environment within minutes, and distances that make the delivery of food, ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies an operational challenge of the first order. The Wehrmacht had encountered cold winters before. The army had fought in Poland, in France, in the Balkans. Some of its soldiers had grown up in Bavaria or Silesia, where winters were hard. A few had fought on the Eastern Front, where the cold was murderous. But Norway was different, and it was different in ways that took the German military establishment years to fully understand, and that it never fully solved. Unteroffizier Hans Grötrup, a signals technician with the 199th Infantry Division stationed near Alta in 1942, kept a diary that portions of survive in the Bundesarchiv in Freiburg. He was 24 years old, born in Württemberg, a baker's son who had been drafted in 1940 and shipped north after training. He arrived in Norway in August 1941, in the brief window of Arctic summer when the sun does not set and the temperatures are manageable, and the landscape has a quality that several German soldiers in their letters described honestly as beautiful. By October, his entries have changed in character. By December, they have changed again. 14 degrees below, he writes on December 3, 1941. The thermometer at the command post read -14 this morning, but the wind was from the northeast, which means it felt like considerably more. I could not feel my feet on the walk from the barracks to the transmitter station, which is perhaps 60 meters. 60 meters! I counted. I was wearing 2 pairs of socks, the felt boots they issued us in October and the rubber overshoes. None of it is enough. Nothing they gave us is enough. 3 days later. A man in the neighboring platoon lost 3 fingers last night. He fell asleep on sentry duty. They found him at 3 in the morning, upright, his rifle in his hands, his fingers frozen around it. They had to break his grip to get the rifle away. 2 weeks after that. I have stopped thinking about the cold as a thing that happens to me. I have started thinking of it as an opponent, a patient opponent who does not get tired and does not get bored and does not lose hope. It waits. I don't know how to fight something that just waits. What Grötrup is describing in that last entry, in the language of a 24-year-old from Württemberg who had no training in military history or medical physiology, is a phenomenon that military doctors and historians would spend years analyzing after the war: the psychological effect of sustained extreme cold on human cognition and morale. It is not simply that cold is uncomfortable, it is that cold, at the temperatures found in northern Norway in winter, demands a continuous and exhausting expenditure of mental and physical energy simply to survive. Every action requires more effort. Moving requires more calories, which requires more food, which requires more supply runs, which require more men and vehicles, which burn more fuel, which has to come from further south. Sleeping requires more preparation. Equipment requires more maintenance. Weapons jam, engines refuse to start. Radio batteries lose power faster. The oil in artillery breech mechanisms congeals until the guns cannot fire. The rubber seals on vehicle hydraulics crack and fail. Lubricants designed for Central European winters become viscous semi-solids that prevent machinery from operating. Every system, human, mechanical, logistical, that the Wehrmacht had designed for Central European conditions begins to degrade the moment it encounters Norwegian Arctic winter, and the degradation is not linear, it accelerates. The German army's failure to prepare for this was not, it should be said, the result of stupidity. It was the result of a planning horizon that simply did not extend to sustained Arctic occupation. The Weserübung planners had thought about the Norwegian winter in the way that men who have not experienced it think about it, as a variable to be managed with additional equipment and sensible precautions. Extra clothing, more fuel reserves, better shelters. What they did not understand, what no one who had not lived it could fully understand, was that the Norwegian winter was not a management problem. It was an environmental condition that demanded a fundamentally different kind of soldier, a fundamentally different logistical system, and a fundamentally different relationship between an army and its supply chain than anything the Wehrmacht had developed in 5 years of war. By December 1941, when Grøtrup is writing his entries near Alta, the German forces in Norway are confronting this reality across every sector of the occupation. In the far north, along the Lizza front, the mountain divisions assigned to take Murmansk have been stopped not primarily by Soviet resistance, though Soviet resistance is significant, but by the impossibility of sustaining offensive operations in terrain and temperature that exceed the physical capacity of the men and equipment assigned to the task. In the central reaches of the country, along the rail line that runs from Oslo through Trondheim toward the north, German logistics officers are discovering that the mathematics of supply in Arctic Norway do not resemble the mathematics of supply anywhere else. A rail line that would serve perfectly well in France or Poland or even central Germany becomes problematic in Norwegian winter in ways that compound with every kilometer of latitude gained. Snowdrifts close cuts in the mountains. Ice on the rails slows trains by 40%, 50% more. Mechanical failures multiply in the cold, and the distances are simply enormous. From Trondheim to Narvik by rail is over 1,000 kilometers, and north of Narvik there is no rail at all, which means that supplies for the Arctic divisions must travel the final distances by coastal steamer, exposed to British submarines and the winter seas of the Norwegian coast, or by road, where roads exist, or by horse-drawn sled, where they do not. General Lieutenant Edward Dietel, the commander of the mountain forces in the far north and perhaps the most capable and clear-eyed German officer operating in the Norwegian theatre, understood this problem with a precision that set him apart from most of his contemporaries. Dietel was 51 years old in 1941, a Bavarian, a veteran of the First World War and the early years of the Nazi movement, and a man who had spent more time thinking about mountain and Arctic warfare than almost anyone in the Wehrmacht. He had commanded the troops at Narvik in 1940, where his force had been cut off and nearly destroyed before being rescued by the broader collapse of Allied operations in Norway. He understood from direct experience what the Norwegian environment did to military assumptions, and he spent the years of the Norwegian occupation writing increasingly urgent memoranda to OKW explaining what his men needed and what they were not receiving, and what would happen if the situation did not change. The memoranda are preserved, and reading them is a useful exercise in the gap between what a commander on the ground can see and what a planning staff 4,000 kilometers away chooses to understand. The soldier in the Arctic, Dietel writes in a memorandum dated February 1942, is not a soldier who happens to be in the cold. He is a different kind of soldier entirely, living under conditions that have no equivalent elsewhere in this war. The standard assumptions of supply, rest, combat duration, equipment reliability, and physical endurance that govern our planning elsewhere do not apply here. I submit this assessment not as a complaint, but as a statement of operational reality, with the request that future planning for the Northern Theatre be grounded in the conditions that actually exist here, rather than in the conditions that exist in Central Europe. The memorandum received a careful filing and no substantive response from OKW. The conditions did not change. Feldwebel Wilhelm Kessler was a different kind of man from Grøtrup. He was 31 years old when he arrived in Norway in September 1942, assigned to a supply company of the 20th Mountain Army near Rovaniemi in Finnish Lapland. Technically outside Norway proper, but serving the same theatre. He had been a schoolteacher in civilian life in a village outside Munich, and he had a schoolteacher's habit of precise observation and systematic notation. His diary, donated to a regional archive by his daughter in 1987, covers his time in the north with a methodical quality that makes it an unusually useful document. Where Grotrup writes from feeling, Kessler writes from observation, and what he observes with a schoolteacher's steady eye is a supply system that is, by the winter of 1942, in a condition that he describes with characteristic precision as organized improvisation approaching organized desperation. The supply problem in the Norwegian theatre by late 1942 was, historians estimate, one of the most complex and resource-intensive logistical challenges the German military faced anywhere in the world at that stage of the war. The figures are striking. To maintain a single division in combat in the Arctic required roughly 3 times the logistical support required to maintain the same division in France, and perhaps twice what was required on the Eastern Front. This was the result of multiple factors compounding simultaneously. The cold required more calories per man per day. Estimates by German medical officers placed the requirement at between 4,000 and 4,500 calories per day in winter conditions against 2,500 in temperate conditions. The cold required more fuel for every vehicle, every generator, every heater. The cold required more frequent replacement of equipment that failed in ways not anticipated by its designers. The cold required more medical resources because frostbite and cold-related injuries removed men from the line in numbers that had no equivalent in other theatres. And the distances required that every item, every loaf of bread, every artillery shell, every replacement spark plug, every pair of felt-lined boots travel further over worse infrastructure with more losses in transit than in any other theatre of the war. Kessler documents this with numbers that read, in retrospect, as damning. A supply convoy that departs Rovaniemi in November 1942 with 500 kilograms of medical supplies, primarily plasma, morphine and frostbite dressings, arrives at its destination 140 kilometers north with 370 kilograms. The remainder has been consumed in transit, fuel burned, men fed on the road, items lost to vehicle breakdowns, items damaged by cold. 140 kilometers, a loss rate of 26%. And this, Kessler notes, is considered a successful run. We consider it a success, he writes, when more than 2/3 of what we set out with arrives where it is going. I was, before the war, a man who taught arithmetic to children. I find that I cannot make these numbers add up in any way that resembles operational sustainability. But I have learned not to express this observation out loud. What Kessler has identified, the arithmetic of Arctic supply, was the central operational problem of the Norwegian theatre for the entirety of the German occupation, and it was a problem that the Wehrmacht's leadership, fixated on the dramatic operational challenges of the Eastern Front and North Africa, addressed consistently with inadequate resources and wishful thinking. The men in the north received enough to survive, mostly. They received enough to maintain their positions, usually. They did not receive enough to mount sustained offensive operations, except in brief windows of summer when the logistical equation temporarily became more favorable. And they did not receive enough to be comfortable, to be warm, to feel that the institution they were fighting for had genuinely thought about what it was asking them to endure. The darkness deserves its own accounting. Above the Arctic Circle, the sun does not rise between late November and mid-January. This is a fact that is easy to state and almost impossible to fully convey to someone who has not experienced it. The polar night is not simply a long night. It is an environmental condition that does things to the human nervous system that scientists in the 1940s were only beginning to understand, and that modern research has since documented in considerable detail. The circadian rhythm, the internal clock that governs sleep, appetite, alertness, and mood, is calibrated primarily by light. Remove the light for 2 months and the clock begins to drift. Sleep becomes disordered, appetite changes, alertness at the times required for military function, sentry duty, patrol, response to alarm, becomes unreliable. Depression, which military medicine in the 1940s did not have the diagnostic framework to identify precisely, descends on units in the Arctic with a consistency that German officers document in their reports using language that circles around the thing without naming it. Reduced initiative, diminished responsiveness. A quality of passivity that I have not observed in these men in other conditions. Men who were, before the winter, active and willing, who have become, through no fault I can identify, slow. The Germans called it Polarnacht, polar night, and they developed, through hard experience, a set of responses to it that were partially effective and partially not. Alcohol rations were increased. Mail was prioritized, with particular effort made to maintain connections between men in the Arctic and their families at home. Leave was granted in rotation, though the distances involved meant that a soldier traveling home from Narvik to Bavaria spent the better part of his leave on trains, arriving home exhausted and returning to the north the same way. Entertainment was organized. Film projectors were brought north and films were shown in dugout cinemas that men had built from timber and corrugated iron, where they sat wrapped in blankets and watched German films about summer and Bavaria, and blonde women and things that bore no resemblance whatsoever to where they were. These efforts helped. Veteran officers consistently note that morale in the Arctic, while chronically low by the standards of other theaters, was rarely catastrophic because the men had each other, because suffering shared is suffering somewhat diminished, and because the peculiar bond that forms between people who have endured extreme conditions together is, by several accounts, among the most powerful human connections that war produces. But the darkness worked on them in ways that no amount of Schnapps or Bavarian comedy films could fully counteract. Unteroffizier Grötrup returns to the theme in January 1942 in an entry that is among the most cited passages in the German Arctic memoir literature. "It has been dark now for 53 days, he writes. "I counted from the last day I saw the sun. 53 days. I have begun to have difficulty remembering what sunlight felt like on my face. I can remember the concept of it, warmth, brightness, the way shadows move during the day. But the physical memory has faded. A man in the bunk above mine, Wexler, says he has the same experience. He said, 'I know the sun exists, the way I know London exists. I have not been there, but I know it is real.' Wexler was trying to be funny. No one laughed." The frostbite statistics from the Norwegian theatre are, by themselves, a sufficient indictment of the Wehrmacht's failure to prepare for what it had walked into. German military medical records, analyzed by historians, including Rolf-Dieter Müller and others who have worked in the Bundesarchiv collections, indicate that frostbite casualties in the Norwegian and Finnish Arctic theatres between 1941 and 1944 ran at rates that dwarfed those in almost every other theatre of the war. In the winter of 1941-42 alone, the German forces on the Arctic front suffered, by historians' estimates, somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 frostbite casualties. Men who were removed from the line not because they had been shot or bombed, but because the cold had damaged their tissue to the point where they could not continue functioning. A significant percentage of these casualties involved permanent injury, fingers, toes, portions of feet and hands that could not be saved. The German medical service, which was by the standards of the era a competent and well-organized institution, found itself overwhelmed not by the volume of combat wounds, but by the volume of cold injuries, which it had not planned for at anything approaching the scale that actually presented itself. The footwear problem was, in microcosm, the entirety of the Arctic supply failure made visible. The standard Wehrmacht boot, the Marschstiefel, The jackboot, that is one of the iconic images of the German army in the Second World War, was a precisely engineered piece of military equipment designed for the conditions of Central European warfare: roads, fields, moderate temperatures, the kind of winter that a German soldier from Bavaria or Brandenburg would recognize and function in. It was not designed for -35 degrees Celsius. At that temperature, the leather of the Marschstiefel conducts cold with a thoroughness that turns it into an instrument of injury. The metal hobnails that provide grip on normal surfaces become pathways for cold into the sole of the boot, cooling the foot from below. The fit of the boot, deliberately snug for march performance, prevents the thickening of socks that represents the primary insulation strategy available to the wearer. Finnish and Norwegian soldiers and Soviet Arctic troops had long since learned that the answer to extreme cold was felt boots or fur-lined mucklucks or similar designs that combined insulation with generous fit, allowing air, the best insulator available, to be trapped around the foot. The Wehrmacht, arriving in Norway in 1940 and expanding its Arctic presence in 1941 and 1942, issued its men the Marschstiefel, the boot of the Central European battlefield, and hoped for the best. The results were predictable and predicted. Dietl had raised the footwear issue in reports as early as the autumn of 1941. German medical officers in the north had documented the relationship between boot design and frostbite casualties with sufficient precision to make the causal chain unmistakable. Eventually, in 1943, the Wehrmacht developed and began issuing the Überschuh, a large felt overboot designed to be worn over the Marschstiefel, providing insulation and fit correction simultaneously. It helped. It helped considerably once it arrived in sufficient numbers, which took time, because the supply chain that was supposed to deliver it was the same supply chain that was losing 26% of its cargo on 140-kilometer runs in Lapland. Kessler's diary notes the arrival of a shipment of Überschuhe in his sector in November 1943, 3 years into the occupation. "They work," he writes, "with a school teacher's dry economy. They work, and the men are very glad to have them. I find myself reluctant to record the obvious observation that they would have been more useful in 1941. Across the width of the Norwegian occupation, the human cost of these institutional failures accumulated in ways that the German records only partially capture and that no single account can fully convey. The men who lost fingers and toes to frostbite were, in one sense, the lucky ones. They went to hospitals, they received treatment, and most of them survived. The men who died of exposure, who fell asleep in the cold and did not wake up, who were caught in blizzards on patrol and were not found until the spring thaw, those men entered the casualty statistics as dead without further annotation. The men who returned from the Arctic theater with psychological damage that 1940s military medicine could not diagnose and did not treat simply returned to civilian life, where the damage continued to manifest in ways that neither they nor the people around them had frameworks to understand. Obergefreiter Josef Brandl arrived in Norway in the summer of 1943, assigned to a garrison company near Tromsø. He was 19 years old. He had been drafted straight from an apprenticeship at a printing works in Augsburg, and he had never been further from home than Munich. His letters to his mother, preserved in the family's collection and excerpted in a 1998 German regional history of the war years, document the arc of a young man's encounter with an environment that exceeded everything he had imagined military service to involve. The early letters are curious, occasionally wonderstruck by the landscape. The mountains above Tromsø in summer are, by all accounts, genuinely spectacular, and Brandl responds to them with the genuine awe of someone who has grown up in the flat suburbs of an industrial city. By October, his letters have changed. By December, they have changed again, and the change is of a particular quality that his mother, responding, clearly recognizes and clearly does not know how to address. "The darkness is the hardest thing," he writes in December 1943. "Not the cold, though the cold is bad. The darkness. In Augsburg, even in winter, there is light from the shops and the street lamps, and the sky never gets completely black because of the city. Here at night, it is completely black. Not dark, black. You cannot see your hand in front of your face, and we stand out in it for hours at a time, and there is nothing at all. And after a while, your mind begins to play with you, because the mind cannot function in complete nothing. It starts to make things up. You hear sounds. You see shapes that are not there. A man in my company, older than me, he said this is normal. It happens to everyone. You get used to it. I asked him if he had gotten used to it. He thought about it and said, "No. But you learn that it is nothing. I am working on the learning." The interaction between the physical and psychological dimensions of Arctic warfare is one of the recurring themes in the German accounts from Norway, and it is one that military historians have documented with increasing sophistication as the post-war decades have brought more analytical tools to the question. The cold and the darkness do not simply add to each other, they multiply. A man who is cold is more susceptible to the psychological effects of darkness because cold suppresses the cognitive resources required to manage fear and maintain orientation. A man who is psychologically affected by darkness and isolation is less effective at maintaining the physical discipline, moving regularly, keeping dry, monitoring extremities for numbness that prevents cold injury. The two phenomena are in permanent interaction, each making the other worse, and together they produce a state that the German military doctors who studied it called polar collar. Arctic fever, though fever is the wrong word, because it is not hot, it is nothing. It is a compound of cold and dark and isolation and distance from home that takes a man who arrived in Norway as a functional soldier and transforms him incrementally and irreversibly into something diminished. The Norwegian resistance added a dimension to the German experience that is worth noting without exaggeration. The Norwegian resistance was not, in military terms, a major operational force. It did not tie down German divisions in the way that partisan movements in Yugoslavia or the Soviet Union tied down German forces. What it did, and what it did with considerable effect, was create in the Germans stationed in Norway a persistent low-level awareness that the environment around them was hostile not just atmospherically, but humanly. Norwegian civilians who provided information to the resistance, Norwegian fishing boats that carried agents and supplies, Norwegian saboteurs who cut telephone lines and derailed supply trains and occasionally killed German soldiers in ways that were never solved. These activities maintained a condition of psychological alertness in the German garrison that compounded with the physical demands of the environment to produce chronic stress of a particular kind. The occupied country was quiet mostly. The violence was infrequent by the standards of other occupied territories. But it was never entirely absent, and its occasional reappearance served as a reminder that the silence was not acceptance. Grotrup notes in an entry from March 1942 that his unit has been informed of a German signalsman found dead in a ditch near a farmhouse, cause of death undetermined, and that since this information was communicated, he has been aware, walking the route between his transmitter station and his barracks, of every window that faces the road. "I count them," he writes. "Every window. I have gotten to know which ones have curtains and which do not. This is not a way to live, but it is the way I live." The supply crisis in the Norwegian theatre reached its most acute phase in the winter of 1943, Sasmau 4, by which point the broader trajectory of the war had begun to alter the Wehrmacht's logistical priorities in ways that further disadvantaged the Norway garrison. The Eastern Front was consuming resources at a rate that left every other theatre chronically short. The Norwegian forces, already operating on the margins of logistical feasibility, found their allocations reduced further as the strategic situation elsewhere deteriorated. Kessler documents this in diary entries that become, by late 1943, almost monotonous in their repetition of the same observations. Requested supplies have not arrived, substitute allocations have been offered and are inadequate. Improvisation has been employed with partial success. The men are managing. The men are managing is a phrase that appears in Kessler's diary with sufficient frequency to constitute a kind of refrain. And it is a phrase that captures something important about the German experience in Norway, that distinguishes it from the more dramatic narratives of the Eastern Front or North Africa. The men in Norway were not, for the most part, dying in catastrophic quantities in pitched battles. They were surviving. They were enduring. They were managing the cold and the darkness and the supply shortages and the isolation and the awareness that the war was going badly elsewhere and that they were not going to be reinforced, and that the thing they were doing here, holding Norway for the Reich, was perhaps not going to matter in the end the way they had been told it would matter. They managed this, most of them, most of the time, with a stoic functionality that their officers documented with a kind of grudging admiration. Not enthusiasm, not ideological fervor. Simply the determination of men who had decided, for whatever private reasons, to do the thing they had been sent to do and to survive it if they could. The Lapland War of 1944-45, when Germany and Finland became enemies and German forces retreating through northern Norway burned and destroyed everything they could not carry, represents the final chapter of the German military experience in Norway, and it is in some ways the most revealing. The scorched earth retreat through Finnmark, the northernmost county of Norway above the Arctic Circle, was an act of military destruction on a scale that has few parallels in the Western European theatre of the Second World War. German engineers and demolition teams destroyed every bridge, every building, every road installation, every harbour facility, every power generator that they could reach. The civilian population of Finnmark, approximately 50,000 people, was forcibly evacuated. Those who did not hide in the mountains and the caves along the coast. Tens of thousands of Norwegians spent the winter of 1944-45 in temporary shelters and refugee camps further south, or hiding in the Arctic wilderness, because the German army retreating through the country had decided that if it could not hold the land, no one would have a livable version of it. This scorched earth was partly strategic, in the sense that the destruction was designed to delay and hamper any Allied or Soviet advance through the region. But it was also partly something else, something that military historians have found difficult to characterize precisely. A final settling of accounts between an army and the country that had defeated it, not in battle, but in the accumulated weight of its winters and its distances and its darkness and its cold. The men who burned Finnmark had spent years in Norway. They had lost colleagues to frostbite and to the darkness and to supply failures and to the slow accumulation of everything that the environment had taken from them. Whether the burning of Finnmark was a tactical act or an act of accumulated rage against a landscape that had never been conquered, only endured, is a question that the documents do not answer directly. But the scale of it suggests something beyond pure military calculation. Josef Brandl survived the war. He returned to Augsburg in the summer of 1945 and resumed his apprenticeship at the printing works. He married in 1949. He had 2 children. He rarely spoke about Norway. His daughter, interviewed in 1997, said that the subject was not forbidden exactly, but that it was clear to everyone in the family that it was not a subject her father wished to revisit. Once, when she was a teenager, she had asked him directly what it had been like, and he had been quiet for a while before answering. He said, "There was a darkness there that I have not found anywhere else. I mean a real darkness, not a figure of speech. A darkness that went on long enough that you stopped believing it would ever end." And he had not said anything else on the subject for the rest of his life. Wilhelm Kessler returned to teaching after the war, to the same village school outside Munich where he had taught before. His diary was found by his daughter after his death in 1971, in a box in the attic. She read it through and gave it to an archive because it seemed, she said, too specific and too carefully written to be thrown away. His final entry before the retreat south is dated October 7, 1944. It reads, "We are leaving tomorrow. They say we are destroying everything behind us. I have been in this country for 2 years and 2 months. I have been cold for most of it. I have sent north many things that were needed and arrived incomplete, and I have written careful records of the shortfalls. I do not know what the records will be used for. Possibly nothing. The mountains here are very clear today. In a certain light, in autumn, this country is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. That is a strange thing to think on a day like today, but it is true." Hans Gruttrup was killed in March 1942, 3 months after his last preserved diary entry. The circumstances are recorded in his unit's war diary. A patrol, a storm, a body recovered 2 days later when the storm cleared. He was 25 years old. His diary was sent home to his family. His father, the baker, kept it until his death in 1959. After that, it passed through several hands before being donated to a Württemberg regional archive in 1973, where it remains. He had been in Norway for 7 months when he died. In 7 months, in his careful handwriting on the pages of a standard Wehrmacht field notebook, he had found language for something that the military planners in Berlin had not found language for at all: the specific quality of what the Norwegian winter did to a man. Not a strategy, not a tactical problem with a tactical solution, a condition, a weight, something you learned to carry, or something that broke you, and something that waited patiently, inexhaustibly, regardless of which. The German army occupied Norway for 5 years, 400,000 soldiers at its peak garrison strength, a country of mountains and fjords and darkness and cold. The Wehrmacht built bunkers and gun emplacements and submarine pens and radar stations and administrative infrastructure on a scale that reshaped the Norwegian landscape in ways still visible today. It also left something less visible, a record distributed across archives in Germany and Norway and Finland, in the diaries of schoolteachers and the field notebooks of young signals technicians and the carefully filed memoranda of mountain generals, of what it actually costs a modern military to occupy a country that the winter will not permit to be occupied on terms the occupier can name. The lessons were available, the documents existed. They were written by men who did not survive to be ignored, and by men who survived and were ignored anyway, and by men who chose silence when the war was over because there were some things that, once experienced, resisted the reduction to words. The Norwegian winter resisted it entirely. It simply continued. It does not require a human language to do what it does. It only requires patience, and it has that in abundance. If this story hit you, like and subscribe. We find these forgotten stories every single day. Here is the question worth sitting with. The German military knew, by 1942 at the latest, exactly what the Norwegian Arctic was costing in men and material, and the institutional response was inadequate for 3 more years. Was that a failure of intelligence, of logistics, of leadership, or of something harder to name? The inability of a military culture optimized for Central European warfare to genuinely reimagine itself for conditions it had never trained to face? And watch this next video. You are not going to believe what these men did. The medical dimension of the Arctic occupation is, in many ways, the most precisely documented and the most sobering. German military medicine in the Second World War was, by the standards of the era, well organized and technically sophisticated. The Wehrmacht's medical corps had learned from the First World War, had developed effective field surgery protocols, had trained its medics to a high standard, and had built a logistics chain for medical supplies that functioned reasonably well in the theaters for which it was designed. None of this preparation translated cleanly to the Arctic, and the reasons it did not translate illuminate the broader failure of institutional preparation for the Norwegian theater. The fundamental problem was classification. The German military medical system was built around the concept of the battle casualty, the man wounded in combat by enemy fire, who required surgical treatment, evacuation, and recovery before return to duty. This is a category of casualty that military medicine knows how to process. It has established protocols, established resource requirements, established timelines. What the Arctic produced in overwhelming numbers was a different category of casualty entirely. The environmental casualty, the man disabled not by enemy action, but by the physical conditions of the environment itself. Frostbite, trench foot, hypothermia. Pulmonary problems from sustained exposure to extreme cold air. Snow blindness. A constellation of conditions that the medical corps had studied theoretically, but had not anticipated encountering at scale, because no one in the planning phase had genuinely modeled what the scale would be. The trench foot problem alone, a condition caused by sustained exposure of the feet to cold and wet without adequate drying intervals, accounted for tens of thousands of casualties across the Norwegian occupation. Trench foot is not frostbite. The tissue does not freeze. What happens instead is that the sustained constriction of blood vessels in cold conditions progressively deprives the tissues of oxygen, causing damage that ranges from pain and swelling to tissue death and gangrene in severe cases. The condition was well documented from the First World War, where it had been a major problem in the waterlogged trenches of Flanders. The lesson of Flanders, that the condition required dry socks, changed at regular intervals, and that this required a supply chain capable of delivering dry socks to the front on a schedule, had been absorbed intellectually by the German medical corps. But absorbing a lesson intellectually and building the logistical infrastructure to act on it are different things. And in the Norwegian Arctic, where the supply chain was already strained to its limits, simply keeping men fed and armed, the additional requirement of regular dry sock delivery represented an operational burden that the system consistently failed to meet. Men kept their socks on for days, for weeks, because there were no dry ones to replace them with, and the damage accumulated. The accounts of the German medical stations in northern Norway during the winters of 1941, 1942, and 1943 describe facilities that are managing a patient load that is the wrong kind of patient load in the wrong kind of facility. A forward aid station designed for bullet wounds and shrapnel injuries is not designed for the treatment of frostbite, which requires controlled rewarming over hours, access to warm water, and a shelter that can maintain stable temperatures. Conditions that are, in the Arctic in winter, extraordinarily difficult to provide anywhere near the front. Men with serious frostbite had to be evacuated, which meant transport over the same roads that were already stretched to capacity with supply runs, which meant delay, which meant that injuries that might have been treated with minimal permanent damage became injuries that resulted in amputation. The German medical records from the Northern Theatre include, by historians' estimates, thousands of amputation cases that were the direct result of evacuation delays. Injuries that became irreversible because the distance between the front and adequate treatment was too great, and the transport to cover that distance too slow. Stabsarzt Heinrich Vogel, a medical officer with the 6th Mountain Division stationed near Sala in Finnish Lapland during the winter of 1942-43, kept a case log that portions of survive in the archive of the German Red Cross. He was 34 years old, trained in surgery at the University of Hamburg, and he brought to the Arctic a clinician's habit of systematic record-keeping that provides a remarkable ground-level view of what the German medical system was actually dealing with. His log entries for the period December 1942 to February 1943 record, day by day, the cases he treated and their outcomes. The entries for combat wounds, gunshot, shrapnel, blast injury, appear in approximately the proportion one would expect from a division in active operations. The entries for environmental casualties appear at approximately 3 times that rate. On some days, environmental casualties are the only cases recorded. On January 17, 1943, Vogel's log records 11 cases. None of them are combat wounds. 8 are frostbite at various stages of severity. 2 are trench foot requiring surgical debridement. 1 is hypothermia in a man found unconscious during a night patrol. The war today, Vogel writes at the bottom of the January 17th entry, was entirely with the temperature. This ratio, environmental casualties outnumbering combat casualties by a factor of 2 or 3 to 1, was, by several accounts, typical of the Norwegian Arctic theatre in the winter months, and it represents a combat effectiveness drain of a kind that conventional military analysis does not easily capture. An army that loses 30% of its effective strength to frostbite and trench foot in a winter season has not been defeated in the field. It has not surrendered ground to the enemy. Its positions are intact, its weapons are in place, its officers are still in command. But it has lost 30% of its effective strength, and those men are gone not for the duration of a wound that heals in 6 weeks, but sometimes permanently. And the men who replace them are men who have not yet learned what the Arctic demands of them, and who will accordingly take a certain number of casualties, learning it as their predecessors did. The Wehrmacht understood this dynamic in the abstract. Dietl, in his memoranda to OKW, articulated it with precision. What the institutional response to that understanding actually looked like, in terms of resources allocated, equipment delivered, training developed, was consistently inadequate for reasons that are themselves instructive. The Norwegian theatre was never, from OKW's perspective, the main event. It was a flank, an important flank, one that Hitler regarded with near-obsessive concern because he was convinced, not entirely unreasonably, that British naval operations and potential Allied landings in Norway represented a permanent strategic threat. But a flank nonetheless, and flanks receive what is left after the main effort has been resourced. In a war where the main effort was consuming everything that could be produced and more, what was left for the Norwegian flank was rarely enough. The German soldier in Norway in the winter of 1942 or 1943 knew very little of this strategic calculus. He knew that he was cold and that the cold was not going away, and that the things he needed to be less cold were not arriving in sufficient quantities, and that the war he had been sent here to fight did not resemble the war he had been trained for or the war he had been told he was fighting. He knew that the days were dark and then darker and then dark in a way that stopped being a description of weather and became a description of something interior. He knew that the men around him were changing, not dramatically, not in ways that required medical intervention, but slowly, the way things change when they are under sustained pressure. Becoming quieter, becoming more cautious, becoming men who counted windows on familiar roads and thought about cold as an opponent and had difficulty remembering what sunlight felt like on their faces. What is striking, reading the accounts that survive, is not how many of these men broke, but how few. The Wehrmacht's soldiers in Norway were not, in the main, ideological fanatics. They were not men sustained by burning conviction. They were men who had been drafted into a war, sent to a place that was, in many respects, the worst possible assignment available, and who endured that assignment with a steadiness that is, in retrospect, remarkable. They endured it because human beings, when placed in conditions that would seem intolerable in advance, generally find resources they did not know they had. They endured it because the men around them were enduring it, and the social pressure of shared suffering is among the most powerful forces available to sustain human behavior. They endured it because the alternative, the specific collapse of the self that begins when a person stops functioning, was worse than the cold, and they could feel that clearly even when everything else was unclear. The Norwegian winter did not care. That is the final irreducible fact of the German experience in Norway, and it is the fact that every account in its own way arrives at eventually. The winter was not malevolent, it was not strategic, it was not interested in German defeat or Allied victory or the outcome of any human conflict. It was simply a physical condition of the planet at a certain latitude in certain months and it operated with the absolute indifference of all natural forces to the purposes and plans of the beings subject to it. The Wehrmacht planned around it. The Wehrmacht adapted to it, partially and late. The Wehrmacht's soldiers endured it, and when the war ended and the soldiers went home, the winter remained as it had always remained on the mountains and the fjords and the frozen ground of the north, patient as Grotrup said, waiting for nothing because it had no need to wait for anything at all.